somewhere around your 73rd birthday, standing alone in a kitchen that used to be loud with other voices, you'll notice something strange happening in your own mind. It won't feel like decline. It will feel like clarity. Not the kind that remembers every date or every name, but the kind that finally sees your whole life without the static that used to drown it out. You were told this would be the fog years, the slow years, the years where things get smaller and dimmer. But instead, something almost nobody prepares you for begins to happen. The noise fades, and underneath it, something quiet and true has been waiting the entire time. Most people never say this part out loud, maybe because it sounds too strange to believe before you've lived it. But by the end of this video, you'll finally understand why it takes 70 years to hear it. Today, you're going to hear 8 quiet truths that almost nobody tells you before you turn 70. Truths about your mind, your memory, your relationships, and your sense of time itself. Not the polite, greeting card version of aging. The real one. The one that explains why so many people, once they finally arrive here, quietly admit they feel more like themselves than they ever have before in their lives. Stay with me, because reason number 1 is the one most people mistake for something going wrong, when really it's the first sign that something is finally going right. Reason number 1, and it's the one that quietly worries people the most. Maybe it happened while you were standing in the pantry, certain you'd walked in for something specific, and for a moment it simply wasn't there. Your first instinct was worry. Everyone's is. We're taught, from the time we're young, that forgetting is the beginning of losing ourselves entirely. But here's what almost nobody explains to you. Your brain has spent 70+ years collecting information, faces, dates, obligations, and somewhere along the way, it started making an executive decision your younger self never had the authority to make. It started deciding what deserves to stay. A name that carries no weight in your life anymore. A fact that served its purpose decades ago and has nothing left to give you today. Your mind isn't hoarding these things the way it used to, and it isn't because it's broken. It's because it has finally been given permission to be selective, the way a wise editor cuts an early draft down to only the sentences that still matter. Think about how much mental space you spent in your 30s and 40s tracking things that didn't actually matter in the end. Other people's schedules, obligations you never wanted, arguments you replayed in the shower for no productive reason at all. That tracking system took energy, and your brain paid for it constantly, all day, every day, without ever asking your permission. Now, it's spending far less of that energy on noise, which frees up something remarkable. Room to actually feel the moment you're in instead of just managing it from a safe, exhausted distance. What looks like forgetting your neighbor's name is very often your mind quietly telling you the truth. That name was never load-bearing in your life, and it never needed to be. You are not losing capacity. You are being handed a filter you didn't have the wisdom to use before, because wisdom itself is what teaches a mind what's actually worth holding on to, and what was only ever taking up space. Think about the last time you misplaced your glasses only to find them on your own head. That isn't proof of failure. It's proof that your attention was somewhere far more important than tracking an object it has trusted your hands with 1,000 times before. Families sometimes see this filtering and quietly worry, watching for something they've been warned about, when what they're actually witnessing is a mind that has finally earned the right to stop multitasking its way through every single hour of the day. You spent decades holding entire households in your head at once. Appointments, birthdays, who needed what and when, because someone had to, and it was you. That job is largely finished now. Your mind knows it, even if the rest of you is still catching up to the news. There's a particular kind of relief hiding inside this, one that rarely gets named, the relief of no longer needing to be the household's memory bank, the family's designated keeper of every date and detail. For decades that role felt like love, and in many ways it was. But it was also a quiet, constant tax on your attention, one you paid without ever noticing the deduction. What you're gaining now, in exchange for a few misplaced names and misremembered errands, is something far more valuable. A mind finally free enough to actually be present with the people it used to only manage. That's not your memory failing. That's your mind finally refusing to carry what never mattered. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. If your mind is filtering out what doesn't matter, what does that say about what it's choosing to keep instead? That question sits right underneath the next one, because the same quiet shift happening in your memory is also happening in something even bigger, the way you experience time itself, hour by hour, day by day. Your mind isn't dimming. It's clearing house. And once the house is clear, you start to notice what was always the good furniture underneath the clutter, which is exactly where the next truth begins. Reason number 2. Have you noticed how a whole year can pass now differently than it used to? Not slower, exactly, but somehow more complete, like it left more of a mark on you than 5 entire years did back when you were 30? That's not your imagination playing tricks. And it isn't a simple trick of fading memory either. In your younger decades, time was mostly counted. Days until the weekend. Years until retirement. Months until the kids were finally grown and gone. You were living by a calendar, and calendars are numb. They don't register meaning, only quantity, only the ticking forward of numbers on a page. But somewhere in the last stretch of years, something quietly rearranged itself in how you relate to time itself. Instead of counting days, you started feeling them one at a time, fully. A Tuesday afternoon with a grandchild on the porch can now carry more emotional weight than an entire month once did, because you've stopped treating time as something you're merely spending and started treating it as something you're actually inhabiting moment by moment. Psychologists who study how people relate to their own future have long noticed this exact shift. When the road ahead feels shorter, the mind stops optimizing for someday and starts optimizing for right now, today, this hour, which sounds like it should feel frightening, but for most people it does the opposite entirely. It sharpens attention instead of dulling it. It makes an ordinary phone call with your daughter feel less like a task to get through quickly and more like something you genuinely don't want to end. This is why people who reach their 70s and 80s so often say the days feel richer even as they feel shorter and fewer, because richness was never actually about quantity, it was always about presence, full presence, and you finally have complete access to it, maybe for the first time in your entire adult life. Notice how differently you now watch the light change in the late afternoon. How a cup of coffee on a quiet porch can feel like an event worth having rather than something to rush through on the way to the next obligation. That isn't idleness. It's a mind that has finally stopped treating the present moment as a waiting room for something better scheduled down the line. You used to ask what's next almost by reflex. Now, more often than you'd have expected at 40, you find yourself simply asking what's here, and discovering that the answer is usually enough all on its own. That's not slowing down. That's finally arriving in your own life instead of just quietly passing through it. If this is already landing somewhere in you, wait until you hear reason number 3, because it explains why so many people over 70 suddenly stop caring what a room full of near strangers thinks of them, and why that isn't coldness at all, no matter what anyone tells you. You've spent decades collecting days like currency, carefully spending them on tomorrow, on someday, on some future version of a life you were still building. Now you're finally allowed to spend them on today instead. And once today becomes enough, something else in you quietly lets go. The part of you that was always quietly performing for someone else's approval. Reason number 3. There's a version of you that used to check the room before speaking. Reading faces carefully, calculating tone, adjusting your words to avoid disappointing someone who might not have even been paying attention to you at all. Maybe you still catch yourself doing it sometimes out of old habit, before you realize a beat later that it isn't necessary anymore. For most of your adult life, that constant social calculation felt like the unavoidable price of belonging to a family, a workplace, a community. You managed your mother-in-law's opinion, your boss's approval, the quiet judgment of neighbors you barely even knew, and you did it automatically, the way you breathe, without ever once adding up the true cost of doing it. But somewhere after 70, something in that internal accounting system quietly shuts itself off. Not because you stop caring about people, you likely care more now, not less, but because you finally understand something your younger self simply couldn't afford to believe yet. Most of that imagined audience was never really watching as closely as you feared it was back then. The harsh judgment you spent decades bracing yourself for rarely actually arrived, and the people who did judge you were usually far too consumed with managing their own performance to notice yours in any detail at all. Letting go of that imagined audience doesn't make you distant or cold. It makes you available. Finally present enough to actually hear the person sitting in front of you, instead of half listening while quietly performing for someone who isn't even in the room with you. This shift is often mistaken by families for stubbornness, when it's really something closer to relief. You're not refusing to bend for the sake of it, you're simply no longer bending for reasons that were never good ones in the first place. Maybe this is why you've stopped over-explaining your choices at the family dinner table the way you used to, why you can now say a simple no without building an elaborate case for it first, the way you once felt obligated to. Your children might read this as a new stubbornness, a hardening they didn't expect from you. It usually isn't that at all. It's closer to a long overdue honesty, finally surfacing because you no longer have the appetite to perform a version of agreeableness that cost you more than anyone around you ever realized. You are not harder to reach. You are simply no longer reachable through old, exhausting channels. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending an entire life fluent in a language you never chose to learn, the language of managing other people's comfort at the expense of your own. Somewhere after 70, most people quietly stop translating themselves into that language, not out of anger, but out of simple depletion, the way a well runs dry not from bitterness but from decades of honest use. What's left, once the translating stops, is something closer to your original voice, the one you had before you learned it was safer to soften it. That's not you becoming difficult. That's you finally being allowed to be real. And once you stop performing for a crowd that was mostly imaginary all along, something even heavier starts to loosen in you. The old grudges you've been quietly carrying, sometimes for decades, without ever consciously deciding to put any of them down. Letting go of the audience was the first weight to fall away. The next one has been sitting on your chest a great deal longer, and reason number 4 explains exactly why it's finally starting to lift. Reason number 4. Maybe there's someone from 30 years ago who still lives, uninvited, in the corner of your mind. A sibling who said something unforgivable at a funeral, a friend who chose the wrong side of an old argument, a spouse who hurt you in a way you never fully said out loud, even to yourself. You probably assumed you'd carry that resentment all the way to your grave, the way it felt so permanently lodged in you for so many years, decade after decade. But here's the quiet truth almost nobody explains about grudges after 70. They don't usually dissolve because you consciously decided to forgive. They dissolve because you simply run out of the energy required to keep hating with any real conviction. Resentment is expensive, more expensive than most people ever calculate. It requires you to keep replaying the injury, rehearsing the argument you never got to properly finish, defending a version of yourself that felt wronged and needs constant maintenance to stay standing. In your 50s, you had the emotional bandwidth to fund that project indefinitely, without even noticing the withdrawal. In your 70s, that bandwidth has narrowed considerably, and your mind, ever the quiet accountant, starts redirecting its limited funds toward what actually sustains you now. Rest, connection, the people still standing in front of you today. One day you simply notice the old anger isn't there anymore at all, and it feels less like a moral victory you fought hard for, and more like setting down a heavy suitcase you'd forgotten you were still carrying through every single room of your life. This is precisely why so many elderly people reconcile or simply stop needing to in these final chapters, not because they suddenly became saints overnight, but because holding on stopped being affordable a long time ago. You might notice it in something as small as being able to sit across from that sibling at a holiday table without the old script running automatically in your head, the argument rehearsed and ready. Or you might notice its absence entirely, realizing months later that you haven't thought about that old betrayal in some time, and feeling almost startled by how quietly it left. This is not the same as pretending the hurt never happened. The memory often stays intact, clear as ever. What changes is your relationship to it, the way an old scar stops aching in the cold the way it once reliably did every single winter. If you've ever wondered why elderly people so often seem gentler than the younger versions of themselves anyone remembers, this is usually why. It isn't that life softened them from the outside. It's that they simply stopped paying the toll on old wounds, and gentleness was what remained once the debt was finally cleared. That's not forgiveness you forced. That's exhaustion quietly turning into peace. If you're still here with me, this next part matters even more than everything before it, because it's the truth underneath everything you've heard so far. The reason your whole story is finally starting to make sense to you, maybe for the very first time in your life. You've let go of noise, of performance, of old anger you carried far too long. What's left, once all of that finally clears away, is something you've actually been quietly building the entire time without ever fully realizing it. The shape of your own story. Reason number 5. Have you started retelling your own life differently than you used to, noticing connections between things that once felt completely random, seeing clearly now how a heartbreak at 26 somehow made room for the marriage that actually worked years later? That's not nostalgia quietly rewriting history to feel better. That's understanding finally catching up to experience. After all this time. While you were living your life, you were simply too close to it to see its architecture, You were inside the building, not standing back far enough to study the blueprint. Every difficult year, every wrong turn, every earlier version of yourself you eventually outgrew felt, at the time, like a series of disconnected events, some good, many painful, most of them simply survived rather than truly understood in the moment. But distance changes what you're finally able to see. Decades later, patterns emerge that simply weren't visible up close. The way a certain kind of loss taught you to hold the next relationship far more gently. The way a failure at 40 became the exact preparation you desperately needed for something important at 60. This isn't your memory softening the hard parts for your own comfort. It's your mind finally having enough elevation to see the whole terrain instead of just the one ditch you happen to be standing in at the time. This is precisely why elders are so often sought out for perspective by younger family members. Not because they remember more raw facts than anyone else, but because they've finally gained the vantage point required to see the through line connecting decades that once felt like completely unrelated chapters of a stranger's life. You are not rewriting your story to make it kinder. You are finally reading it correctly, cover to cover, for the first time. Maybe you've noticed it in the way you tell stories to your grandchildren now. How a hardship you once described only as painful has quietly grown a second half. The part where it taught you something you couldn't have learned any other way. That isn't you softening the past for an audience. It's you finally being able to hold the whole story at once, beginning and end, instead of just the chapter you happened to be trapped inside at the time. This is a kind of authorship no younger version of you could have managed. Simply because the book wasn't finished yet. Younger people, still deep inside their own unfinished chapters, often mistake this clarity for simple nostalgia, a soft focus lens applied after the fact. But nostalgia longs to return to the past. What you're doing is different. You're not longing to go back, you're finally able to look back calmly and see the whole shape of the road instead of just the patch of ground directly beneath your feet at any given moment. That's not hindsight softening the truth. That's understanding arriving late, but arriving whole. You used to be afraid of running out of time. That fear shaped decades of your life more than you probably ever admitted out loud, even to the people closest to you. But something has been quietly happening to that fear, and it isn't what you'd expect at all. There is a moment, somewhere in the last long stretch of a full life, when an old truth stops whispering and finally says itself plainly, out loud, in your own voice. It rarely arrives with any real drama. It usually arrives in something small. A late afternoon light through a familiar window, a phone call from someone you love, an ordinary Tuesday that suddenly feels almost unbearably precious to you. As the writer George Eliot once put it, it is never too late to be what you might have been. Not because time somehow reverses itself, but because the version of you finally capable of seeing this clearly was always going to take exactly this long to arrive at all. The quiet truth is this: nothing was truly lost on the long way here. It was simply being gathered, slowly, patiently, until you finally had enough of it to understand what all of it meant. Reason number 6. You used to lie awake sometimes, decades ago now, gripped by a very specific kind of fear, running out of time, dying with things left unfinished, disappearing before you truly mattered to anyone. That fear hasn't disappeared entirely, if you're honest with yourself, but it has slowly changed shape into something almost unrecognizable from what it used to be back then. The fear of dying, abstract and distant when you were younger and healthier, has been slowly replaced by something far more immediate and, strangely enough, far more useful to you now. The fear of an entire afternoon slipping quietly by unlived while you sat inside your own head instead of in the room with the people you actually love. This isn't a smaller fear than the old one. In many ways it's a sharper one, because it can't be soothed by vague promises about someday. Someday has gotten considerably shorter, and your mind knows this now, deep down, without needing to be told. But this new fear does something the old one never could manage to do. It makes you actually show up today, right now, in this specific hour. It's the reason you call your daughter instead of quietly waiting for the perfect moment that may never arrive on its own. It's the reason you say the kind thing out loud instead of simply assuming she already knows how you feel. Fear, when it's finally aimed at the right target, stops being paralyzing and starts being genuinely clarifying. It tells you exactly where your attention actually belongs, right now, today, in this specific hour, rather than in some vague future you can no longer honestly count on stretching endlessly ahead of you the way you once did. This is likely why you've started saying the harder, softer things out loud lately. Telling an old friend what their friendship actually meant to you, instead of assuming the feeling was already understood without being spoken. It's a small, quiet urgency, nothing like panic, more like a gentle hand at your back reminding you that the people in front of you are not guaranteed to still be there tomorrow, and neither, quietly, are you. That's not fear shrinking away. That's fear finally pointing you toward what actually matters most. If you're still with me, hold on a little longer, because what's coming next might be the quietest truth of all. The one about the silence you spent your whole life trying so hard to avoid. Reason number 7. There's a certain kind of evening, the house completely empty, the phone silent, no one expecting you to be anywhere in particular or to say anything at all. That used to feel almost unbearable to sit inside. For most of your life, silence meant something had gone quietly wrong. An empty house meant you'd somehow been left behind by everyone. A silent phone meant you'd been forgotten entirely. You filled every spare moment with noise, obligation, other people's voices and needs, partly because you genuinely loved all of that fullness, and partly because the alternative felt like uncomfortable proof that you didn't really matter to anyone at all. But somewhere in these later years, something in that old equation quietly rewrote itself without your permission. The same silence that once felt exactly like abandonment has slowly started to feel like something else entirely. Company. Your own company specifically, which turns out to be a very different thing from loneliness, even though from the outside the two can look almost identical to anyone watching. Loneliness is the sharp ache of wanting someone who simply isn't there with you. What you're feeling now, in the very best of these quiet moments, is something closer to comfort, the settled sense that you no longer need constant distraction to feel like your life has real value, because you've finally settled fully into the value itself without needing anyone else to confirm it for you. You might notice it on a quiet Sunday morning, tea in hand, nothing scheduled, no guilt tugging at you to fill the hour with anything at all. Just the simple, undramatic pleasure of your own thoughts moving at their own unhurried pace. Of course, there's a difference between this kind of peaceful solitude and true isolation, and if the quiet in your life ever feels heavier than this, more like being cut off than settled in, that's worth mentioning to someone who cares about you. But for most people who reach this chapter, the silence they feared for so long turns out to be one of its gentlest surprises. Proof that the person you've spent a lifetime becoming is, at last, someone worth spending an afternoon with alone. This shift rarely gets talked about openly, maybe because it sounds strange to anyone who hasn't lived long enough yet to reach it themselves, but it may be one of the most underrated quiet gifts of these later years. You get to keep your own company and actually genuinely enjoy the visit. That's not loneliness. That's your own presence, finally welcome in the room. You've spent this entire video hearing about everything that quietly falls away after 70. The noise, the performance, the old grudges, the familiar fear. What's left standing, once all of that finally clears, is the one truth this entire video has been quietly circling since the very first sentence. Reason number 8, and it's the one all the others have been leading toward. Who decided your life meant something in the first place? Take a real moment with that question, because most people spend their entire lives assuming the answer lives somewhere outside them. In a career title, in what the neighbors happen to think, in whether the kids called often enough, in some external scoreboard they never actually agreed to keep but somehow spent 60 years playing by anyway, without question. Here, in these later years, something remarkable quietly reveals itself to you, often all at once. You were the one keeping score the entire time. Nobody else was ever actually holding the pen, no matter how it felt back then. The meaning you're finally able to see clearly in your own story, the marriage that mattered so much more than the job ever did, the ordinary Tuesday that turned out to be more important than any promotion, the quiet, unglamorous work of raising a difficult child who eventually became a genuinely good adult. None of that meaning was ever assigned to you by anyone else. You made it, moment by moment, decision by decision, usually without even noticing you were doing it at the time, the same way a slow river carves an entire canyon without ever once intending to build a monument to itself. Somewhere along the way, you stopped waiting for someone to hand you a verdict on whether your life had counted for something, and you started simply living it as though it already had, quietly, without an audience, without applause. That's not resignation. That's the closest thing to authorship a human life actually offers. Not control over what happens to you, but ownership over what it eventually comes to mean. This is the quiet truth sitting beneath everything else in this video. Clarity in old age was never really about suddenly understanding the world better than before. It's about finally understanding that you were never just living your life passively. You were authoring it, actively the entire time, and the pen was always only ever in your own hand. That's not too late. That's exactly, precisely on time. So here's the quiet truth this whole video has been circling since that very first sentence in your empty kitchen. Your mind after 70 isn't fading. It's finally finished collecting everything it ever needed to see you clearly, and what it's decided to keep, in the end, is the part of you that was always the truest. The forgetting, the silence, the letting go of grudges and imagined audiences and old familiar fears. None of it was ever really loss. It was your whole life quietly being distilled down to what it actually always was, underneath all the noise you spent decades mistaking for meaning. That's why the clarity feels so strange at first, almost suspicious. It isn't new information arriving from nowhere. It's the oldest truth you have, finally loud enough for you to hear it clearly. You didn't lose your sharpness on the long way to 70. You found out, at last, what it was always meant to be sharp about all along. Nobody tells you this in your 40s because nobody could. You have to actually arrive here to believe it, the same way no one can describe the view from a mountain you haven't yet climbed. So if you're sitting there tonight wondering whether something is wrong with you for feeling clearer, calmer, and quieter than the world led you to expect, let this be the answer you've been waiting decades to hear. Nothing is wrong with you. Something finally is right. If any part of this found you tonight, in whatever kitchen or quiet room you happen to be sitting in right now, I'd genuinely love for you to stay a little longer around here. This channel exists for exactly this, for the truths that take decades to become simple enough to finally say out loud. Subscribe if you'd like some company for the rest of the way, because there's a lot more worth saying, and I'd honestly rather say it to someone who's actually listening than to an empty room. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Whatever room you're sitting in, whatever hour it happens to be where you are, know that you were heard tonight fully by at least one person paying real attention. It mattered more than you know.